December 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The wind sweeps across the flat prairie, carrying dust and the distant hum of machinery. Inside the barbed wire fences, rows of wooden barracks stand silent under a pale winter sky. German prisoners, once soldiers of Hitler's mighty Wehrmacht, now line up for morning roll call. Their uniforms are faded, their boots patched with scraps of canvas. But what captures their attention is not the guards, it's the sound. Beyond the fence, an endless convoy of trucks rumbles by on the highway. Massive engines roar, hauling crates of grain, fuel, and food. The prisoners stare in disbelief. Machines everywhere, moving with relentless precision. No ruins, no bombed cities, only power, order, and abundance. One of them mutters softly, almost to himself, "Das ist das Land der Maschinen." This is the land of machines. He doesn't yet know that within months, those same men would begin to call America something else. A name that would echo in memoirs and memories long after the war ended. The land of machines. And mercy. By 1942, the tide of World War II had begun to shift. The Allies, pushing from North Africa toward Italy, were capturing thousands of German and Italian soldiers each week. As the desert battles of El Alamein and Tunisia drew to a close, convoys of Axis prisoners stretched endlessly across the sand, weary, dust-covered men whose faith in the Reich had begun to crack. But victory brought an unexpected problem for the Allies. By early 1943, they had over 300,000 German POWs on their hands, too many to guard and feed in war-torn Europe. The British were already struggling with overcrowded camps. The Americans, untouched by the devastation of bombing and with an immense industrial base, offered a solution: send them across the Atlantic. And so began one of the largest prisoner transfers in modern history. From ports in Algeria and Egypt, captured soldiers were herded aboard Liberty ships. For many, the journey was surreal. 1 week fighting under the burning sun of North Africa, the next standing on the steel deck of a U.S. transport ship, watching the Atlantic swell beneath them. Most expected punishment, humiliation, or worse. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a land of brutality and racial chaos, a place where prisoners would be starved or worked to death. But what awaited them was something entirely different. When the first ships docked in New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, the prisoners were met not by angry mobs or armed tormentors, but by military clerks, Red Cross officers, and long trains waiting to carry them inland. Many of these trains bore the mark of America's unmatched industrial strength. Sleek locomotives pulling endless lines of freight cars, moving through landscapes untouched by war. From the Atlantic coast to the heart of the Midwest, new POW camps began to rise almost overnight. By 1944, more than 700 camps had been constructed across 46 states, from California's sun-baked deserts to the pine forests of Alabama. The largest could house up to 5,000 prisoners each. These were not gulags or labor prisons. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was obligated to treat POWs humanely, but what surprised many Germans was how strictly those rules were followed. Prisoners received medical care, were fed 3 meals a day, and were even paid small wages for their labor. Inside the camps, life was disciplined but not cruel. Guards followed procedure. Inspections were routine, and violence was rare. German officers were saluted according to rank. Chaplains held Sunday services. Some camps even had libraries and orchestras, and outside those fences, America moved like a machine. For the first time, these soldiers saw what industrial power truly looked like. Towns with streetlights that never went dark, vast fields tilled by tractors instead of horses, factories operating day and night, producing planes, tanks, and ships faster than anyone in Europe thought possible. It was in those moments, watching this rhythm of efficiency and abundance, that a quiet realization began to settle among the prisoners. They had been fighting a nation unlike any other. The very country their leaders had mocked as soft, materialistic, and chaotic now stood as a symbol of power built not on conquest, but on productivity. Yet beneath that awe, another feeling began to take root: confusion. Because along with the machines came something they hadn't expected: decency. Guards who shared cigarettes, civilians who waved as they passed, farmers who trusted them with tools and work. The German POWs had entered America expecting a land of machines. But what they were beginning to glimpse was something far deeper, a land capable of mercy for most German soldiers. Captivity in America began with disbelief. Before capture, their understanding of the United States came entirely from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, a distorted image designed to mock and dehumanize the enemy. Posters and broadcasts described America as a land of greedy capitalists, a place of racial decay and moral weakness. Americans, they were told, fight with machines, not courage. But propaganda has a fragile foundation. It cracks the moment truth stands beside it. When these same soldiers were marched through American ports, they saw something entirely different. Civilians lining the streets did not spit or throw stones. Children pointed curiously at the gray-uniformed prisoners, and mothers carried on shopping, their faces calm. The prisoners were stunned, not by hatred, but by indifference. Soon, they were loaded onto long trains bound for the heartland. Through the carriage windows they watched a landscape unlike anything in Europe. Miles of farmland, small towns with white steeples, clean roads, and neat houses untouched by bombs. Smoke rose not from ruins but from factories and steel mills that fed the arsenal of democracy. When they reached the camps, in Texas, Iowa, Georgia, or Oklahoma, they found fenced compounds surrounded not by concrete and barbed wire brutality, but by open fields and distant forests. Inside, the barracks were wooden and plain, but orderly. Each man received a mattress, blankets, soap, and a small locker. It wasn't home, but it was humanity. The first shock came at mealtime. Prisoners, accustomed to the rationing and hunger of wartime Europe, were handed metal trays filled with generous portions: meat, potatoes, bread, coffee, sometimes even fruit. To many it seemed absurd. Why would a nation feed its enemies so well? Yet this was America, a country governed as much by law as by power. The Geneva Convention rules were followed not out of weakness, but out of principle. For every American POW held in Germany, the U.S. demanded reciprocal treatment. That sense of fairness extended even further. American officers regularly inspected camps to ensure standards were met. Red Cross trucks delivered mail and books. Still beyond the fences lay the greatest surprise. Local farmers and businessmen were suffering severe labor shortages. Millions of American men were fighting overseas, and someone had to harvest crops, repair roads, and build infrastructure. So, the U.S. government allowed German POWs to work, not as slaves, but as laborers earning small wages and war credits. The prisoners went out under guard at first, picking cotton in Texas, cutting timber in Louisiana, working in canneries in Wisconsin. But as trust grew, the guards often stayed behind. Farmers began leaving prisoners unsupervised for hours, even inviting them to share lunch at their tables. It was an unspoken truce of humanity. For men raised in a system of fear, this kindness was disorienting. They began to question what they had been told about democracy, about freedom, about the so-called enemy. One former POW later recalled, "In Germany we were taught Americans were lazy and brutal. But in the camps we saw something we did not expect: order without oppression, strength without cruelty." Within months something remarkable began to happen. Camps developed their own small societies, newspapers printed in German, orchestras performing Beethoven, even classrooms where U.S. officers encouraged education. Some prisoners studied English, economics, or philosophy. Others built models, painted murals, or wrote journals, reflecting on the world beyond the fence. These moments of thought and creation, small acts of the human spirit, began reshaping how they saw their captors. What started as fear slowly transformed into reluctant admiration. They saw how Americans valued efficiency, how machines and manpower worked together seamlessly, and how that system wasn't fueled by tyranny, but by collective will. The prisoners were beginning to understand that the land of machines was not cold or soulless. Its strength came from an idea that progress and humanity could coexist. And as the months passed, they began to feel a subtle shift within themselves. Their worldview, shaped by years of indoctrination, was breaking apart, piece by piece, replaced by a quiet respect for the people who held them captive, yet treated them like men. The world outside the camp fences was still burning, but inside, another kind of battle had begun, a battle of conscience and awakening. Every war leaves behind two kinds of prisoners, those bound by walls and those bound by belief. For many Germans behind the barbed wire of American soil, captivity had freed them from something deeper than chains. It had freed them from illusion. To understand, Why they would one day call America the land of machines and mercy, we must look at their experience through several distinct lenses, beginning with the two that struck them first: technology and human decency. From the moment German POWs stepped off the transport trains, one thing dominated their senses: machinery. America seemed to hum with an endless mechanical rhythm. They had seen tanks and trucks before, but never this scale, never this order. In Germany, the war economy ran on desperation. Parts scavenged, fuel rationed, factories shattered by bombs. Here, everything moved with purpose. Massive tractors plowed perfect furrows through golden fields. Endless trains carried grain and coal from one horizon to the next. Even camp kitchens buzzed with mechanical precision. Electric mixers, conveyor lines, tin can openers that worked flawlessly. To men raised under a system that glorified struggle and scarcity, this abundance felt unreal. They began calling America Das Land der Maschinen. But these weren't weapons of destruction. They were machines of life, tools that fed, built, and transported. One POW later wrote in his diary, "We realized that America's power did not lie in its soldiers, but in its factories, and the ordinary people who knew how to use them." For many, this industrial order became their first glimpse of a different kind of power: civilized strength. A strength built not on fear, but on efficiency, not on ideology, but on cooperation. Inside every camp, the evidence of this industrial culture was inescapable. The food, the materials, the mail system, all worked with clock-like reliability. The prisoners noticed that even the guards' uniforms were standardized, stitched in vast factories where design met precision. They began comparing it silently to the Germany they had left behind, a nation collapsing under the weight of its own war machine, where soldiers were now scavenging for fuel and food. It was not just a contrast in production, it was a contrast in purpose. In America, the machine served man. In Hitler's Germany, man served the machine. If America's mechanical rhythm impressed them, its humanity bewildered them. At first, they waited for cruelty. Every POW manual they had studied warned of torture and humiliation. Yet days passed, and the guards treated them with cold professionalism, even courtesy. When sick, they were taken to medical tents. When a prisoner died, he was buried with military honors. For men who had been taught that mercy was weakness, this was a moral shock. The camp guards were often young Americans, farmers, clerks, or college boys, with little hatred toward their prisoners. Some even tried to practice their German, exchanging words over cigarettes. It was not friendship, but it was respect. Soon an unlikely rhythm developed. POWs worked in American fields and factories by day, returned to camp by night, and shared stories across language barriers. One Kansas farmer later recalled, "They worked hard, polite boys. You'd never think they'd been our enemies a year before. When the crop came in, we brought them pie from the house. My wife even taught one to say, 'Thank you.'" For the Germans, this kind of behavior was disarming. Many had been taught that mercy existed only within the fatherland, that enemies were subhuman. Yet here they were, treated with dignity by the very people their army had sought to destroy. That realization began to erode something far more dangerous than ideology. It began to erode hate. Within the camps, small acts of compassion accumulated: a guard allowing a sick prisoner extra bread, a doctor bending rules to send a letter home, a farmer gifting a pair of gloves to a man working in the cold. No propaganda could explain this. Slowly, prisoners started helping each other more, organizing concerts, even teaching English classes. The atmosphere, though fenced and guarded, was becoming unexpectedly human. The guards noticed it too. One U.S. officer wrote in his journal, "You can see it in their eyes now. They've stopped looking at us like enemies. They look at us like people." And so, side by side with the hum of machines, another current began to flow, a current of empathy. For the Germans who once marched under banners of conquest, the simple civility of America struck deeper than any weapon. Because in this land of efficiency and order, they were discovering something they hadn't known existed, a land where even power had a conscience. And that realization would lead them to question everything they once believed about strength, victory, and humanity itself. For years, Nazi propaganda had built a powerful illusion. that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, that democracy was weak, that mercy was hypocrisy. Inside those lies, young men were raised to believe brutality was strength and obedience was virtue. But in the American camps, those ideas began to fracture, quietly, relentlessly. The prisoners saw it first in the guards' behavior. They enforced rules but did not humiliate. They maintained order without hatred. And for the first time, the Germans encountered an authority that did not demand worship, only discipline. Letters home reflected their astonishment. One prisoner wrote, "We were told America was chaos, run by Jews and blacks, a place of moral decay. But I have seen order here and kindness. We were deceived." Another described the strange fairness of it all. Here, even a captured enemy is treated as a man. It makes one wonder what kind of government trusts its people this way. Such realizations did not come easily. Many officers within the camps still clung to the old ideology, forming secret Nazi circles to preserve loyalty to the Reich. They tried to silence dissenters, holding illegal trials and spreading fear, but their control weakened. As news trickled in about the destruction of German cities, the collapse of the Eastern Front, and the discovery of concentration camps, the old faith shattered. American intelligence officers, running quiet re-education programs, began supplying POWs with newspapers, magazines, and even films showing Allied reconstruction and democratic governance. Slowly, the truth sank in. The war they had fought so proudly was built on lies. The moral impact of that realization was profound. These were not defeated men anymore. They were awakening men. Paradoxically, many German POWs later said they experienced their first taste of freedom inside American captivity. They were no longer bound by propaganda, no longer required to shout slogans or fear secret police. For the first time, they could think, question, and doubt, all under the protection of the very enemy they once sought to destroy. Psychologists who visited the camps noticed it too. The men's posture changed over time. They smiled more, argued openly, even joked about their former officers. In some camps, American officers organized discussion groups, encouraging prisoners to debate political philosophy, human rights, and moral responsibility. For many, these were their first encounters with democratic ideas, not through lectures, but through lived experience. One prisoner later described it this way: "Behind the wire, I discovered what freedom means. We could read, argue, learn, without fear of punishment. We began to understand that liberty is not chaos, it is dignity." That psychological evolution, from indoctrination to introspection, was one of the quiet victories of the American system. No re-education camp in Germany could have achieved what simple decency achieved in America. Life in the camps became a reflection of the German soul, reshaped, softened, searching. With time, culture flourished. Orchestras formed using donated instruments. Choirs sang Bach and Mozart. Amateur theaters staged plays, even comedies. Art studios appeared, where prisoners painted murals of both German villages and American fields. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, a full orchestra of 70 men played classical concerts that guards and prisoners attended together. In Texas, POWs built model towns from wood scraps and wire, complete with tiny cars and street lamps. The U.S. Army encouraged it all, believing that creativity would maintain order and morale. But it did more than that. It restored identity. For men stripped of purpose, these cultural outlets became a bridge back to humanity. They wrote poetry about the contrast between the broken Europe they left and the functioning America around them. They taught each other mathematics, carpentry, and English. Some even corresponded with local schools, exchanging drawings and Christmas cards with American children. Through these small acts of connection, a remarkable transformation occurred. The enemy became a neighbor, the stranger became a teacher, a former prisoner recalled. "In the beginning, we thought of escape every day. But after a year, no one wanted to. We had found peace, not outside, but within." When the war news finally reached the camps, Hitler dead, Berlin in ruins, there was no celebration, no defiance, only silence. Many wept, not for the Führer, but for the truth they had finally seen. As these men stared across the fences at the land that had captured them, they no longer saw the enemy. They saw the future, a nation built not only on machines of steel, but on machines of principle, discipline, and compassion. The land of machines had revealed its second face, the land of mercy. And soon, that revelation would reach its most emotional point, the moment when the war ended, and those same men would witness a kind of grace no propaganda could ever erase. December 24th, 1944, Camp Algona. Iowa snowflakes drifted softly over the barracks' roofs, settling on barbed wire that glistened in the pale moonlight. Inside, the faint sound of a harmonica mingled with murmured voices. For thousands of German POWs, it was the second Christmas spent far from home. But tonight felt different. The war in Europe was reaching its brutal crescendo. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Ardennes was burning, the Battle of the Bulge raging in the frozen forests of Belgium. Yet, here in the heart of America, inside a camp for the enemy, something extraordinary was unfolding. As dusk fell, the camp commander, an American major from Nebraska, made a quiet decision. He ordered the guards to stand down from their usual posts and permitted the prisoners to hold a Christmas service. He even had the chapel decorated with pine branches and candles provided by local churches. When the German prisoners entered, they stopped in silence. Before them stood a simple wooden cross, and beneath it a small nativity scene carved by fellow POWs from scrap wood. The air smelled faintly of wax and cedar. One of the prisoners, a young theology student from Munich, began to play the organ. The men sang softly, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Guards outside stopped to listen. Some removed their caps. A few American soldiers, far from their own families, quietly joined in the song, their English voices blending with the German ones in a shared whisper of humanity. In that moment, the fences, uniforms, and flags seemed to vanish. Only men remained, tired, homesick, yet united by something older than war. When the final note faded, the American commander stepped forward. He addressed the prisoners simply. No one should be without peace tonight. Merry Christmas, gentlemen. For the German soldiers, this gesture cut deeper than any speech. They had expected to spend the night in silence, thinking of ruined cities and missing families. Instead, they were offered dignity and peace. That night, word spread through the barracks of how the Americans had shared their rations of coffee and chocolate with the prisoners. Some guards even brought handmade gifts, wool socks, carved toys, cigarettes wrapped in paper bows. A few prisoners, in return, presented drawings, crafted figurines, or hand-stitched ornaments for the guards' families. These were small acts, almost invisible against the vast machinery of war, but they would remain engraved in memory long after the guns fell silent. Over the next months, similar scenes played out across dozens of camps. In Texas, Alabama, and Oklahoma, American officers allowed cultural festivals, sports games, and even debates. In some places, the POWs built chapels with their own hands, carving the words, Frieden auf Erden, peace on earth, into wooden beams. And as spring of 1945 approached, the news began to filter in. Germany was collapsing. The Reich was dying. Hitler's armies were retreating or surrendering. For the prisoners, this was a time of unbearable contradiction. Relief that the war was ending, but also shame at what their nation had become. When the first reports of concentration camps surfaced, the horrors of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Auschwitz, disbelief turned to silence. American officers brought photographs, eyewitness accounts, and newspaper clippings. At first, many refused to believe them. Propaganda, some muttered. Impossible. But then came captured letters, testimonies, and German radio broadcasts confirming the truth. One POW remembered the day he saw the photographs. It was as if the earth had opened beneath us. We could not speak. We could not look at each other. We realized we were not the victims. We were the guilty ones. From that moment on, everything changed. The kindness they had received, the food, the fairness, the respect, now carried a new and painful weight. They began to see it as mercy undeserved. Even their nickname for America, the land of machines, began to evolve. Because now they understood that behind every machine, every factory, every efficient system, there was something else driving it. Moral will. The same nation that built the most powerful arsenal in human history had chosen not to crush its enemies, but to treat them with decency, and that moral contrast was the true turning point. Many German POWs later said that they were re-educated, not by lectures, but by the behavior of ordinary Americans, Guards who never raised their voices, officers who enforced rules with fairness, civilians who waved from passing trucks. Through the quiet consistency of that mercy, they began to see the real strength of democracy, that it did not need to destroy to prove its power. As April 1945 arrived, the war in Europe neared its end. In the camps, anticipation mixed with dread. The prisoners knew that freedom was coming. But what awaited them in Germany? They would soon learn that returning home would not erase what they had witnessed in America. It would follow them, shaping the conscience of a generation that would rebuild their country from the ashes. But before that could happen, the end of the war would bring one last test. One final moment when these former enemies would see the true depth of America's mercy. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news reached Camp Algona just after dawn. A courier jeep roared through the front gate, its tires hissing over wet gravel. The driver jumped out, clutching a telegram. Within minutes, the words spread like wildfire. Der Krieg ist vorbei! The war is over. Inside the barracks, stunned silence fell. Some prisoners smiled faintly, others sat motionless on their bunks. A few wept openly. For them it meant freedom, but also uncertainty. They didn't know what kind of Germany they would return to. The American guards gathered the men in the central yard. The camp commander, the same man who had allowed that Christmas service months earlier, stood before them. His voice carried over the crowd. Gentlemen, the war in Europe has ended. You will soon be repatriated. Until then, you will continue to be treated as soldiers, not enemies. Let's finish this chapter with dignity. He saluted. To everyone's astonishment, hundreds of German POWs straightened their backs and returned the salute. It was not out of obedience, but respect. That night, as the stars burned quietly over Iowa, a group of prisoners gathered around a handmade radio they had secretly built months earlier. They tuned into a German broadcast from Flensburg, the new provisional government. The voice crackled through the static. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The room went still. No cheers, no cries, just silence, heavy and endless. For years they had fought believing in a cause greater than themselves. Now that cause lay in ruins. One prisoner whispered, Wir haben alles verloren, außer unsere Ehre. We have lost everything, except our honor. But even that felt uncertain. Days later, the American guards noticed something strange. The German prisoners began cleaning the camp voluntarily, sweeping the yard, repairing fences, planting flowers near the mess hall. When asked why, one prisoner replied quietly, Because we want to leave this place better than we found it. To the Americans, it was just another small gesture. To the Germans, it was redemption. They began writing letters home, not about battles or victories, but about what they had learned from their captors. A letter found years later in an archive read, They defeated us without hatred. They guarded us without cruelty. And they showed us that strength can be gentle. If Germany is ever to rise again, it must rise with that same spirit. June 1945. The trains began arriving, long lines of boxcars waiting to carry thousands of German soldiers back across the ocean. At the platform, the Americans distributed Red Cross parcels for the journey. Inside each parcel was food, soap, and a small booklet printed in German. Democracy, what it means, and how it works. Many of the prisoners tucked it into their coats as they boarded. The guards shook hands with them, something unthinkable just 2 years earlier. One prisoner, a former Luftwaffe pilot, looked into his guard's eyes and said, I came here believing America was only factories and money. But now I know. Its real power is its heart. The guard smiled and replied, Remember that when you go home. When the ships finally sailed from New York, hundreds of German POWs lined the decks. They watched as the Statue of Liberty faded into the gray horizon. Some saluted. Others stood silently, lost in thought. What had begun as captivity had ended as awakening. Back in Germany, the returnees found a country shattered beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins. Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, nothing but skeletons of stone. But among the wreckage, the former POWs carried something that could not be bombed away. A new understanding of justice, work, and freedom. They had seen democracy, not as propaganda, but as practice. They had seen fairness even in victory, and many would later become mayors, teachers, engineers, and community leaders in the new Federal Republic. Quietly, they shaped post-war Germany with the lessons they learned behind American fences. One of them, Karl-Heinz Weber, later testified, "In America, we found what we had been told didn't exist: decency in the enemy. We came home determined to build a Germany that would never again fear such a power, but rather deserve its friendship." Yet, not all stories ended in peace. Some prisoners returned home to suspicion, poverty, or despair. Many were haunted by what they had learned of the Holocaust. Some could never reconcile the kindness they had received with the crimes committed in their name. And for a few, America would remain a bittersweet memory, a place where they first tasted freedom, even behind barbed wire. August 1945, Camp Algona. Now half empty, the once crowded barracks stood silent. The baseball field grass had grown tall. The American flag fluttered gently in the evening wind. A single German prisoner remained behind, a carpenter who volunteered to help dismantle the camp's wooden structures. He worked alone, hammer echoing in the stillness. When asked why he stayed, he replied, "Because this place changed me. I want to take it apart with respect." He would later carve a wooden plaque from the final beam, inscribing the words, "Here, we were prisoners, but we became free men." And so ended one of the most paradoxical chapters of World War II, where mercy, not might, conquered the hearts of the defeated. The German POWs who had once marched to war under swastikas would go home carrying a different banner, invisible, but powerful, the belief that humanity could survive even war itself. The war was over, but its echoes lingered in the hearts of millions. Across the Atlantic, ships carried home not only American soldiers but also the thousands of German POWs who had once lived under the stars and stripes. By 1946, more than 400,000 German prisoners had been held in the United States, scattered across 700 camps from Maine to California. Their presence had reshaped the American landscape in quiet, unexpected ways. In the South, they had harvested cotton and built irrigation ditches. In the Midwest, they had repaired fences and picked corn. In the West, they had cut timber and helped rebuild bridges. When they were gone, small towns felt strangely empty. The same men once viewed as enemies had, over time, become part of the community. Local newspapers began publishing farewell messages written by American farmers. To the men of Compound 8, thank you for your hard work and good conduct. You've shown us that even in war, decency has no uniform. In some places, American families even invited the prisoners to their homes for farewell dinners. Those gatherings, awkward yet warm, became symbols of a quiet reconciliation that no treaty could ever dictate. A few guards wept when the trains departed. Some prisoners did too. When the Germans returned to their devastated homeland, they found everything they had once known buried under ash. Cities were silent. Families scattered. The Reich, the world they had fought for, was gone. And yet, those who had been POWs in America brought back something rare: hope. They had seen a country where machines built not only weapons but prosperity, where citizens questioned authority without fear, where the defeated were treated with dignity. In post-war Germany, these men became silent ambassadors of a new idea, that power need not be cruel, and that nations could lead by example, not domination. Historians later observed that the re-education of German POWs in America had an indirect yet profound effect on the creation of West Germany's democratic identity. It wasn't just the formal lectures or pamphlets distributed in camps. It was the lived experience, the respect shown by guards, the fairness of trials, the simple act of being treated as human. Dr. Gunther Neumann, a former POW, summarized it best in a 1953 interview. They didn't try to humiliate us. They let us think, they let us work, and they let us see what freedom looked like. That was America's most powerful weapon. American officials had hoped the humane treatment of prisoners would discourage future militarism. They didn't realize it would do even more. It would plant seeds of friendship. It would plant seeds of friendship. By the 1950s, former German POWs were corresponding regularly with their American counterparts. Some even emigrated back to the U.S., settling in the same towns where they had once been confined. In a few cases, POWs attended reunions with their former guards, men who had once stood on opposite sides of barbed wire, now shaking hands as friends. But not all memories were soft. Some prisoners carried trauma, guilt over their participation in Hitler's army, confusion over their own moral boundaries, sorrow for those who never returned. Yet even in those shadows, one truth stood tall. The compassion they had received had rewritten their understanding of victory and defeat. They had come as soldiers of a defeated empire. They returned as witnesses to a civilization that fought with machines, but conquered with mercy, and that realization would ripple through Europe for decades to come. In the years that followed, America's treatment of German prisoners became one of the most studied, and least expected, success stories of World War II. At a time when Europe lay divided between victors and ruins, the story of the POW camps offered a rare glimpse of humanity amid chaos. The Geneva Convention had set the minimum standard. America had gone beyond it. When Soviet captivity meant starvation, and British camps often meant hard labor under cold skies, the United States offered something different: order, respect, and even opportunity. To many former POWs, that contrast would shape how they viewed global politics in the decades ahead. By 1948, as the Cold War emerged, the ideological lines between East and West hardened. But for thousands of Germans who had once been held in America, the choice between Soviet communism and Western democracy felt clear. They had seen the difference. In their letters, memoirs, and later interviews, many would describe America as the nation that defeated us without hatred. These experiences quietly supported U.S. efforts to rebuild Germany as a democratic ally. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, was met with trust not only because of money, but because of memory. The German people remembered that even their captured sons had been treated fairly. In Washington, a few American officers recognized what they had unintentionally achieved. A classified report from 1947 described the POW program as a strategic victory through ethics. The report noted, "The humane handling of enemy personnel has created an unexpected reservoir of goodwill in post-war Germany. These men may be among the strongest deterrents to future aggression." It was a subtle, moral diplomacy, one that used compassion as a weapon far more effective than fear. Meanwhile, in Germany, the story spread from village to village. A carpenter from Münster told how he learned carpentry again in a Texas camp. A former U-boat sailor described playing violin in an American orchestra. A farmer from Bavaria said his first lesson in democracy came from a Kansas sheriff who treated him like a man, not a prisoner. These tales passed quietly between families, gradually softening old hatred. Some historians even believe that these experiences helped shape the post-war German work ethic: disciplined, honest, and focused on rebuilding through cooperation rather than conquest. But the legacy extended far beyond Germany. During later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, American policymakers often cited the POW experience of World War II as a benchmark for ethical conduct. The idea that strength must include mercy, that a nation's true power lies not in destruction but in restraint, became a moral compass for generations of military officers. Even in the darkest moments of the Cold War, when nuclear brinkmanship threatened annihilation, the quiet memory of America's wartime decency stood as proof that humanity could coexist with power. Today, decades after the last camp was dismantled, fragments of those years remain. In the small town of Algona, Iowa, a museum now stands on the site of the old POW camp. Inside, visitors can see carvings made by German prisoners, tiny wooden figures, intricate models of churches, even a nativity scene built entirely from scrap wood. Every Christmas, the display is lit again, just as it was in 1944. Tourists stand before it in silence. Children press their hands to the glass, and somewhere in that fragile glow, the story of machines and mercy comes alive again, not in words, but in spirit. As one plaque at the museum reads, "They came as enemies. They worked as men. They left as friends." That inscription captures what no treaty or headline ever could: that beneath the machinery of war, the greatest power America revealed was its mercy. In the vast history of World War II, filled with devastation and cruelty, the story of the German POWs in America stands apart, quiet, almost forgotten, yet deeply human. It is a reminder that even in the most violent of eras, decency can survive. These men had marched across Europe under banners of conquest. They had believed in superiority, in destiny, in the machinery of war. But when they came face to face with another kind of machine, the American system of fairness, productivity, and compassion, they found something greater than victory or defeat. They found humanity. The camps they once called land of machines became lessons in what those machines truly represented. Not just industrial power, but the discipline, logic, and respect that built them. And the land of mercy they spoke of was not born of softness, but of strength. The kind of strength that guards prisoners with integrity, that rebuilds enemies with empathy, and that believes civilization is measured not by how it wins wars, but how it treats the defeated. When the barbed wire finally came down, those men carried that lesson back to a ruined homeland. They taught their children that honor was not found in domination, but in dignity. Some never forgot the sound of distant American machinery at dawn, a rhythm of industry that became, in their memories, a heartbeat of hope. In the end, the legacy of those years cannot be measured in statistics or treaties. It lives in the quiet understanding that power and mercy are not opposites. They are partners. And somewhere, on the windswept plains of Texas or the cornfields of Iowa, where once stood the fences of captivity, the echo of that truth still lingers, that the greatest victory of all is to defeat hatred without becoming it.